Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among this week's news items we have a plague scare in the UK. Man paralysed able to control robotic arms using just his mind. Blue light and the effect of sleep, particularly when we look at old age. Male octopuses survive sex using paralytic venom. How often you should wash your clothes, or at least exercise clothes. TikTok misinformation is altering the youth's understanding of ADHD. Researchers have been able to disprove their own research, which is at least somewhat entertaining, and the largest carbon molecule found on Mars further supports the case that, at least at some point, there was life, Martian life. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with diseases, or at least in this case, a false alarm. There was concern that bubonic plague, or Black Death, however you wish to call it, may have been occurring in the UK, but this is solely based on the report that came up on an automated system. An automated system that incorrectly mixed up the data, meaning that no, there wasn't an instance that was of concern. This is not to say it couldn't be a concern. Both in the UK and in the USA, a plague is something that's present in wild animals. Because of this, you can theoretically be infected if you interact with said animals. Now, at least in the UK, it's not so easy because, well, it's a little more challenging to get infected. It doesn't mean you can't be, but as long as you aren't going up and licking every wild animal or hugging them or trying to pat them, you're not going to get infected easily. The other thing to note here is that, strictly speaking, a plague is a bacterial infection. So one of the easiest ways to be infected is via fleas. They circumvent the skin, which is the major protective barrier, preventing the human body from being infected because, well, they bite through it to suck your blood. Theoretically, if a human is then infected, well, they can then spread it from there. But it can also be treated, so it's not like this is the end of the world now, thankfully. It means that the UK won't lose in between a third and half of its population. The other notable thing here is that, no, this was a false alarm, so you don't need to worry about an outbreak of Black Death. Something that you should be concerned about is an instance of someone being infected with Brucella suis after eating feral pig. Now, the man in Florida, admittedly elderly man, given he was 70, developed the life-threatening infection after he ate feral pig way back in 2017, so we're talking about something fairly old here. But the reason why he became infected is fairly straightforward. He handled the raw meat with his bare hands. Now, if we're talking about animals raised in a farm or similar, they're not going to carry these sorts of diseases. It's why it's safe to handle the meat barehanded. Not necessarily the best idea, but it's relatively safe. On the other hand, feral animals or wild animals, not so much, because you don't know what they've encountered or when. So this brings us to the unfortunate instance with this man possibly coming very close to dying because he ate pig. Well, pig in this case might be a little bit of an oversimplification. What makes the infection dangerous is not so much that he's been infected, it's that the infection is very sneaky. The bacterium itself can basically hide inside of the immune cells, thereby preventing it from being cleared out from the body. After all, most of the time the immune system doesn't get rid of immune cells once they've passed general muster. Because of this, and because, well, hunting animals is always dangerous, just you don't know if you're going to die of the animal or from eating the animal, the infection lasts a long time with very little by way of symptoms. Maybe you'll get a mild fever, you might get, say, a headache or feel a little bit unwell, but nothing to be particularly notable. Then, if you get blood tests, you won't find them either because, well, they're hiding inside the immune cells. This brings us to what happens once the infection really gets going. For whatever reason, it gets a head start and suddenly it tries to kill you. Now, it could be due to, say, you catching another disease, such as COVID, which might put a particular level of stress on your immune system, meaning it focuses on that and not the bacterium. Or you might, say, undergo a period of extreme stress. Because of this, the increase in cortisone could dampen your immune response. And there are plenty of other ways this can happen. This leads to the man in question who also had another complicating factor. Well, several, but the first was that he had a defibrillator implanted. That defibrillator is meant to keep his heart working, and it does, but it also provides the perfect place for the bacterium to hide. and cause all sorts of issues with his heart. Considering the man also had diabetes and other complications and comorbidities, yeah. You can see how this gets very messy very quickly. Now, he was repeatedly admitted to hospital and given antibiotics and other treatment for his chest pain and problems, but he kept going back because it just never went away. So doctors went with the admittedly extreme but necessary solution of removing the pacemaker, because that's the only way to ensure you completely remove the original source, once infection has occurred, of the bacterium suis. Because of this, the man was eventually cleared of all infection, and at least now he has a new defibrillator and theoretically shouldn't die from the infection. But then again, we also don't know if he'll have other issues later on, at least in America, other issues such as bankruptcy from medical care. In further medical news that's slightly less exotic, we have the ability to control a robotic limb using the power of your mind. Now, unfortunately, this is not cool wireless technology. This is very much wired technology, but despite this, the ability to be able to use some sort of robotic limb despite complete paralysis of all limbs, or tetraplegia, means that this could be a massive move forward for, well, in this case, paralytic people. The idea is very simple. You basically have an implant into your brain that reads the various neuron signals. This is called the brain-computer interface, and through the algorithms that analyze this and learn to figure out what's going on, you can then send a signal to the arm to do something. Which sounds all well and good, and very importantly, it doesn't require, let's say, major modifications, let's call it. It basically works mostly without issues from the get-go. In this case, we're talking about 7 months, but despite this, it's still a fairly substantial improvement over not being able to do anything. What somewhat separates this technology from others of a similar kind, other than the fact that it's at least a current example, is simply that it adjusts for a lot of the variations that occur over time, because you get used to the robotic arm, the brain has various fluctuations and so on, which are all considered a kind of drift. Normally you'd need to recalibrate to adjust for these, but this particular robotic arm doesn't require that anywhere near as much. Well, arguably not as frequently, but still. Now, whether or not the robotic arm can be used for various other things than just reaching and pulling is up for debate still, but nonetheless, it's a huge improvement over some of the other technologies available now. Next we have an article from The Conversation, which is more ironic than anything, and it's that losing weight for some people could actually be deadly for them. Which, okay, we're overstating it. Essentially, the issue here is that various people have certain issues when they try and apply diets. That is, if you are obese, you try and lose weight. But if you try and lose weight too quickly, this can increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. Which, given you also have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease from being obese, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. At least if you don't go on a diet, you get to enjoy your meal, which, at least there's that. The key here, though, is that it's a fairly small study for the claims being made. We're talking about 8,000 people, and it's all data being submitted to the UK Biobank, so it is, let's say, limited, but although limited, it's not necessarily completely wrong. It's just very, very preliminary. Frustratingly, the researchers do try and present various well-established historical facts in terms of genetics and distribution of various things as some sort of groundbreaking revelation. For example, that Tonga has a significantly higher rate of obesity, which all relates to genetics and things like, say, the warrior gene as it's called, which does increase the deposition of adipose tissue across the body. Nevertheless, it's at least something to consider if you're trying to lose weight. Slow and steady is better than just trying to drop all the weight in one go. In just as obvious news, but also at least slightly more useful, it's the use of blue light in the morning helps old people sleep better. Now, the inverse of this has been well known for quite a while now. It's why blue light reflective glasses have been relatively popular in the tech industry for some time. But using blue light in the morning, that's a different matter entirely. So the idea here is simple enough. Take a small number of people, in this case just 36 individuals who are over 60, and give them 2 hours of blue light in the morning, and then see how they sleep. This was also supported with the use of regular plain white light twice a day, And the entire experiment lasted several weeks, so there's a lot of questions as to how long the effects last, is it something they need to adapt to, and so on, but all things said and done, the results are fairly straightforward. That is, the blue light helped with better sleep quality, and of course the better you sleep, the better your activities are, the better your general stress conditions. Overall health improves somewhat with sleep, but not the permanent kind of sleep that old people have eventually, or rather we're talking about the normal kind of sleep. What the researchers appear to present as the underlying cause is exactly why blue reflective lights have been popular in the tech industry. That is, you are training your circadian rhythm to operate properly. That's why, for example, night mode is a common feature in most operating systems now, wherein the screens will develop an increasingly red tint and decrease the amount of blue light that comes out in order to help your brain recognize that, no, it's now nighttime. And so, if you allow your brain and body to filter out the necessary light, or in this case, manually do so, you're able to create a scenario in which your body goes, okay, this is when I start working properly, and this is when I stop, or at least decreasingly work properly. In the case of old people, they're or at least somewhat along that pathway. It's just a matter of how long you can maintain it. Next, we are going to look at the human family tree. Admittedly, the human family tree in terms of evolution and how there are certain splits in our population that occur along the way, and some of them are more, let's call it, unusual than others. And one of these weird splits occurs about 1.5 million years ago. Now, 1.5 million years ago doesn't seem like that long, but at least in terms of the human population, it's fairly substantial. What gets weirder is that in terms of that family tree, well, it kind of takes after Alabama. It comes back together about 300,000 years ago, which again is, in terms of evolution, not that long, but in terms of the human population, it's a fair time ago. The thing here is we're not talking about, say, the Denisovian or Neanderthal DNA crossing over, which has its own questions, let's call it. Rather, we're talking here more about a, let's say, internal schism within humans. And this is where things get a little bit questionable for this study. In fact, kind of questionable. They've basically worked on the premise that certain genes would have a probability of coming from certain particular lines, that is, branches within the family tree. And because of that, they have to statistically say that, yes, this is where and when certain splits or convergences of these DNA, in family tree terms, would have occurred. And yeah, it gets a little bit difficult here. The other, let's call it a noteworthy claim, is that the population that appears to have both split off and then merged back together has contributed extensively to the existence of Neanderthals and Denisovians, which would indicate that this particular approach both has benefits and significant demerits in terms of being able to explain what's going on, as it's very unlikely that Neanderthals and Denisovians just appeared out of nowhere. They likely existed before this, and will likely continue to exist after this, as is shown. But despite that, it's an interesting approach to the question of what humanity did and how it survives. In a question of survival, we have octopuses, and in particular, we have male octopuses surviving sex. As is the case of just about every male in many species, such as spiders, octopuses obviously, possibly humans, having sex with a female is a very dangerous exercise. And the only way octopuses have found to survive this particular activity is to stun their female partner with venom. Yes. This sounds very much like drugging a partner, and it certainly is, but it's not drugging the partner for the reasons initially thought. The blue-lined octopus, or Hapalocalina fasciata, is a tiny octopus that only a few centimeters, or about an inch or so long. But it's also incredibly dangerous as it produces a neurotoxin, specifically a teterodoxin. This is the same thing pufferfish have. That neurotoxin, let's call it, is used to protect the male octopus, which is roughly half the size of the female octopus, when they have intercourse, because if they don't do that, there's a good chance that after sex, they'll be eaten, the same way a male praying mantis may lose its head. This is on top of, let's say, other evolutionary adaptations to try and keep the male alive, at least to some extent. This includes developing an extra long tentacle, which is specifically designed or made, evolved, selected for, to deliver sperm from a greater distance, reducing the probability of, well, being eaten. And as we mentioned in the past, other times they will literally rip off their tentacle penis and throw it at their mate. Since the blue-lined octopus lacks both of these particular adaptation methods, it relies on, well, giving its partner a, in this case, neurotoxin to paralyze them so they don't get eaten during sex, or after sex. In other environmental news, we have a schism in the environmental movement. It's a split between farming and attempting to create renewable energy via solar farms. The irony is not lost there. The issue here is fairly straightforward. At least in south of Spain, there is an attempt to evict hundreds of olive farmers in order to make room for a solar farm, but the rationale is fairly straightforward. That is, we need energy and our current sources aren't keeping up, so let's use large farming space and, make energy. The problem is that, well, Spain's major production things include things like olive oil and olives, which does mean you're now removing a GDP thing in order to make room for energy, which could be good, could be bad. At least it's a renewable, which is better than, say, burning olive oil. Another proposed problem with this is that, well, you are now uprooting and removing a large sequestering carbon source, that is the olive trees. If all of this was taken as it is, and you would argue that, okay, well, they are sacrificing those particular trees, but they're getting energy in response, it sounds like it would be perfect, but nearly all of the energy that's supposed to be generated is going to be exported to the rest of Europe, which does mean that nobody in Spain is actually getting any benefit from it, which is one of the objections at present. There are also concerns here that there may be not necessarily corruption, but certainly massive questions about the legality and processes being used to not only acquire this land, but also in how they're trying to set it up in order to effectively circumvent various laws. Now, strictly speaking, none of this is corruption per se, or rather it's an application of the law as it is written, and certainly a creative interpretation and application of it, in a way that allows them to, for all intents and purposes, turn this from being a very simple issue to a very slippery and oily issue. Essentially, it's trying to mix oil and water, where oil is the attempt to create green energy, and water is the attempt to farm. In similar environmental news, although this time much closer to home, in fact theoretically at home, we have washing clothes, but specifically exercise clothes. Why you would want to go through the filthy, dirty process of exercising is beyond us. After all, it contributes to global warming. Okay, controversial takes aside. There is a simple reason why you do and don't want to wash your dirty, sweaty gym clothes. The first reason is that, well, they are dirty, sweaty gym clothes, therefore they not only smell, but they've got your sweat right through them, which makes them uncomfortable to wear. The other side of that, though, is that you are using water and energy to do so, which will obviously have an effect on the environment. And the third side of it is that, well, every time you wash clothing, you are reducing its serviceable life. Admittedly by a tiny amount each time, but it does happen. Even, let's say, certain governments, such as in France, where they already smell of garlic, so they're probably not too worried about smelling of sweat, suggest you only wash your clothes after wearing them 3 times, which is fairly substantial. This brings us to an interesting, let's call it, article from the conversation, which talks about the factors to consider. For example, the fabric type, is it natural or synthetic fibers? How intense your exercise levels are, the season, your personal health, and so on. Now, some of their advice is more useful than others, but the tips they provide are to turn your clothes inside out in order to allow them to dry after exercising, which does make some sense. Ensure clothes are completely dry before storing. Store them in a well-ventilated area in order to avoid the buildup of nasty stink. Clean them using non-washing methods such as UV light, and, well, separate your dirty and clean clothes, which this last piece of advice probably shouldn't have been necessary, but then again, they are offering advice on how to avoid washing your clothes, so... Next we have dark oxygen, and why it is that dark oxygen, as weird as that may sound, and no, it's not some sort of Jedi thing, is, well, a new discovery, but not really. In fact, it's a discovery that's been known about for a while, but also ignored for quite a while. In this instance, dark oxygen, other than sounding very edgy, is a way of or a term for oxygen that's produced via a method that doesn't involve any kind of sunlight. As a very broad rule, the understanding is that to get oxygen, you need some sort of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires sunlight, but that's why researchers who are finding oxygen in the very great depths of the Clarion-Clipperton zone in the Pacific Ocean were ignoring their findings. After all, you don't have any kind of sunlight at 4,000 meters down in the ocean. You have either destroyed small submersible vessels full of very rich people, a whole bunch of geothermal vents, and occasionally creepy weird fish, but you don't have sunlight. At least, that was the general understanding and assumption until 2021, when the researchers who were finding this decided, you know what, I keep getting these results, I'm going to look into it again with another method in case my initial results are actually right and it's not a faulty sensor like I thought. This leads to the method that they believe is responsible, although again it could well be that it's not the exact mechanism. It involves polymetallic nodules, basically rocks that are full of different metals. Now, the difference in metals is very important to this process, as what it does is create essentially a giant battery. That battery then means you have a different electrical potential, and that can interact with the seawater. And because it interacts with the seawater, which acts as a giant solute containing fluid, the same sort of thing you have in a battery, you end up with what is a giant oxide creator. It quite literally splits off the oxygen and the hydrogen from the water, which allows you to create, well, oxygen, obviously. And that's what they're finding here. And it's not just that this researcher who's publishing the conversation has found it. And Chinese studies have found the same thing. So now, next time you get asked, oh, how and why is oxygen made, you can respond with either photosynthesis or weird metallic nodules in the depths of the ocean. In other news that's going to asking all sorts of questions such as why, how, and what, TikTok is leading to a misunderstanding about ADHD, which shouldn't be happening because TikTok is a cancer, and people shouldn't be assuming any information contained on it is remotely accurate. But for some reason, yes, they are. And so this has led to problems around the understanding of the issues to do with ADHD and the health complications that come from this. The reason for this is actually rather straightforward and honestly kind of stupid. They're all, for all intents and purposes, anecdotes about the individual's experiences with ADHD. That means you might have one person say that I experience this particular cluster of symptoms, and another person saying I experience only this cluster of symptoms, and people will just go, okay, person 1 is right and person 2 is wrong. Which doesn't really work that way. Not only can symptoms differ somewhat drastically between people, but as we've mentioned in recent weeks, not only is the diagnosis process drastically different to the symptoms of it, but that even the diagnosis criteria and the process of getting a diagnosis can vary over time. The problem with this can be best shown with the data that the university studying this has produced, and it's fairly straightforward numbers. If you're a professional, at least somewhat familiar with ADHD, the best videos get about 3.6 out of 5, and the worst will get something like 1.1 out of 5. If you're a complete novice and know nothing about this, the best get 2.8 and the worst get 2.3, which means there's not much perceived difference between the worst videos and the best videos by those who don't know anything better. In unrelated news, but news that's arguably far more interesting, it's the impact in part from the recent Trump administration changes to funding, but also just the world in general. And that's Springer Nature, which went public a while ago, has had its share price crash by about 25%. Now, admittedly we are talking euros here, so this value will vary somewhat from country to country, but in terms of just its impact, the loss of 25% of a share or stock's value just because they're not able to get, well, in this case basically public funding, is huge and could well have implications above and beyond what you might initially think. It's not just that it's hard to get funding for research, but because research isn't funded, nothing's being published, because publishing, at least in places like Springer, is kind of bullshit with the amount they charge. And most researchers would have to grow a kidney in a petri dish in order to sell that kidney to then pay for the publication. In publishing research, we have interesting, let's say, self-defeating developments. It's that researchers who found a particular result regarding the ability to produce, or in this case, not produce energy from Earth's rotation have found that actually you can, which is both good and bad. Good in that it's a source of clean energy, and bad in that their original research has now been proven wrong, which, to be blunt about it, we're actually quite happy with this, simply because, well, researchers who look at their research and go, can I actually prove that I'm wrong, are incredibly rare and deserve to be praised for what they've done. This is a case of failing successfully. The idea is fairly straightforward, and it's that the Earth has a magnetic field, and the Earth rotates. Therefore, in theory, we have a rotating magnetic field. That means you should be able to use it very similar to other devices that produce energy in the same basic way. Think of it as basically being a giant magnetic field or motor. The motor has a series of magnets and wires. When the magnets move around the wires, or the wires move around the magnets, they generate electrical charge, and that's what they thought was impossible here. But it turns out, yeah, you can actually do that. This is where the problem lies, so to say, or at least the solution to the problem that was thought to be already solved. If you have a magnetic field moving around in a particular environment, any difference in charge between molecules in that environment should resolve themselves fairly quickly and fairly naturally, thereby preventing a difference in electrical charge, thereby preventing the generation of energy. But apparently that's not the case. But you do need very specific, very narrowly tailored, and very, very strictly designed means of not only figuring this out, but actually using what's been found. First of all, you need your fancy device. It's about a 29.9 centimeter long tube. It's roughly 1 foot, although not quite. The cylinder is made up of manganese and zinc, along with iron. Now you need these 3 particular metals in it in order to ensure magnetic diffusion occurs. That is that effect you mentioned earlier about things rearranging themselves to remove any change in charge. This at least reduces the ability and speed at which that happens. By using that, you're able to create that energy through Earth's rotation and the magnetic field it carries. How much energy, though, is not a lot. It's 18 microvolts. So, yeah, it basically uses more energy than it actually generates in this particular scenario. The other thing here is that, as with all incredibly highly customized and prototype technology, the ability to scale it up just may not ever happen. Not just because it's incredibly difficult, but because it just may not be effective at a larger scale. In astronomical news, moving a little bit further away from Earth, we have the asteroid that may not hit Earth, but it'll come back for a second try. The asteroid, called 2024 YR4, it was on a trajectory that could threaten Earth. Now, it's now thought that it will miss Earth, which is no fun at all, as, well, seeing a mass extinction event is always the start of great and exciting Hollywood films. No, wait. The reason it's exciting is that we might build giant Earth defense platforms. No, wait. It's exciting because something. Yeah. Anyway, the idea here is that the tiny chance of it hitting Earth has basically gone away, and given its size, that's not a bad thing after all. It could well have caused a mass extinction event. But it's going to go in such a way that it will pass by Earth, most likely, but it's going to come back to give another attempt in 2032, which means that we have 7-ish years after it passes this time to try and figure out how we're going to stop it, if it poses a threat at the time. This does also raise some fairly straightforward questions about whether or not in Starship Troopers the bug meteorite was actually sent by the bugs, or if it was just something that humanity screwed up and missed, which is quite likely given even at the moment we can only pick up 40% of the asteroids that actually provide a threat to Earth. In picking up things that are hard to find, we have very large carbon molecules on the Martian surface, or in this case, actually quite shallow given the capacity of the Martian rovers to actually drill down and find these things. Curiosity has been able to find the interesting finding, let's call it, by sampling a small amount of Earth. The samplings found what is kind of important to look at in terms of what it is. It's a linear carbon chain. Now, linear carbon chains are, if you want to think of them in a very rough way, Basically anything that's a fuel, so think of any petroleum type product or an oil and you've got a rough idea. If it's shorter than this, let's say somewhere around 6 carbon chains, they generally form a circle rather than a long linear chain. And that's a key difference. We've now found long carbon chains in the form of 10, 11 and 12 carbons. We found sulfur in an elemental form, and we found a variety of other structures which indicate that there is a good chance of very early, very preliminary, very rudimentary biological life on Mars as a high possibility. As much as it sounds awesome that there may have been essentially ancient Martian life, it's also not necessarily the case. It's entirely possible that abiotic processes, that is, processes that involve no life form whatsoever, led to the creation of the same things. It's a fairly well-established process. You can break down larger molecules like this into these formats, but that's not anywhere near as exciting or interesting. And certainly, at least in terms of the optimistic outlook on alien life, we can hope that there may have been, admittedly no longer, but at least in the distant past, life on Mars, even if it was some of the most rudimentary and basic life. And that's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.